name is Maggie Fleming, and I am the incoming chair for the GrowSmart Maine board, and I'm also the chair of the events committee. And we're really excited to have you with us today for our How to Make ADUs Work in Your Community webinar. And today we have 4 distinguished panelists: Chris.Lee, Head of Design and Development at Backyard ADUs; Chelsea.Torrey, Mortgage Loan Officer at Town and Country Federal Credit Union; John Boyton, Planner for the City of Belfast, Maine; and Eli Rubin, Community Planner for the City of Portland. And we'd like to thank our webinar sponsor, Kennebec Savings Bank. And I'd also like to note that this webinar is part of GrowSmart Maine's educational outreach as a participant in the Department of Economic and Community Development Housing Opportunity Program. And we have Hillary Gove with us today from that program, and she's going to help out during the Q&A if there's anything that the panelists can't answer. And I'd like to take a moment to do a quick land acknowledgement. I'd like to take a moment to honor the people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac peoples. These people are the traditional inhabitants of the lands of the state of Maine, and no matter where you're watching from today in Maine, you are on traditional Wabanaki territory. And in thinking about your personal relationship with Maine and future opportunities for the state during today's webinar, please consider the relationship that members of the Wabanaki Confederacy have shared and continue to share with this place as well. So why are we here today? Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are a smart growth tool for increasing affordable housing options. And last year, the state recognized this in adopting LD 2003, which aimed to increase the likelihood of ADU construction by loosening zoning restrictions. This law goes into effect on January 1, 2024 for municipalities with the town council form of government, and on July 1st, 2024 for municipalities with a town meeting form of government. And we hope this webinar will provide information for people interested in the legislation and ADU construction, financing, and permitting. Today's program will be 90 minutes. We'll go until about 6 p.m. and we'll leave time for audience Q&A at the end. We encourage you to turn your videos on, but please remember to keep yourself on mute during the panel. And if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A, please use the raise your hand function or type your questions into the chat box. And today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. And I'd also like to note that we have an updated community guide on ADUs on our website. And also, we'll be sending a feedback survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you'll take some time to complete. So with that, I'd like to start the panel. So I'd like to go around and have each of the panelists take a few minutes to introduce themselves and talk briefly about how their work relates to ADUs. So we can start with Chris.
Fix that real quick. Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Lee. I'm head of design and development at Backyard ADUs. That means I do all of the pre-construction work right now for permitting ADUs at Backyard ADUs. I'm here because we build ADUs. Sounds kind of redundant, but we had the really excellent opportunity to get started right as towns in Massachusetts and Maine and across New England were starting to liberalize their zoning bylaws. And we've been the first to build detached ADUs in a lot of these towns, and we've kind of got to help push it along. To date, at the end of this year, we'll have built 50 small homes in ADUs across New England. We build down on the Cape, we build in Boston, we build in Western Mass, and of course here in Maine. And we're doing this because we see it as a really neat opportunity to gently increase density. And it tends to be a relatively affordable way to add homes, even after the insane cost increases of the last 4 years. And I'm looking forward to talking about it tonight.
Thanks, Chris. Let's have Chelsea go next.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Chelsea.Torrey. I'm a mortgage loan officer with Town and Country Federal Credit Union. I handle a lot of, varying transactions from purchases to refinances, and then I facilitate our consumer lending teams progress in home equity products. And then in addition to that, I'm a loan packager, a certified loan packager for the USDA Rural Development Direct Loan Program, which did enhance its program requirements within the last couple of years to allow for accessory dwelling units, which was never before the case, which is really exciting. However, they do have to be on the same power as the primary unit, so they can't be on separate service. But so yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Maggie, and looking forward to this discussion.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. Eli.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks, GrowSmart, for having this webinar. My name is Eli Rubin. I'm a community planner with the city of South Portland. And when I started working for South Portland, City Council had recently done a significant revision to its ADU ordinance. And that's it's been wonderful. It's seen a really increased interest in the community. And so I think mostly what I'll probably be able to speak about tonight is kind of on the inside from the permitting point of view, the steps that we've taken, and kind of from the ground floor, how we've worked to implement the ordinance and work with applicants, work with property owners on developing their ADUs.
Thanks. And last but not least, John.
Yes, I'm John Boynton. I'm the city planner for Belfast. And I've been with the city for about 4 years at this point. Like Eli, our department is the organization that helps folks with permitting and ordinance revision. The ADU ordinance in Belfast has been around since 2017. So we've had some interaction with it during that time. Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks, John. And now for the next several minutes, we're going to do a Q&A discussion with me and the panelists. And I have questions that are sort of targeted at each panelist, but feel free, anyone that would like to jump in once one of the panelists is done, if you want to add something. I want it to feel like a discussion format. So we'll start with some questions for Chris. So Chris, can you tell us what is an ADU and kind of describe the difference between an ADU and a tiny house?
Absolutely. So half of the time when somebody calls us, they're looking for a small house on a standalone piece of land, which is not what an ADU is, but it's kind of neat that it's becoming synonymous with just smaller dwelling units. But what it really is it's essentially a loophole for gently increasing density in single family neighborhoods. It's a small dwelling unit, could be in a garage, could be in a basement, could be out in someone's backyard, and usually has size restrictions, typically has owner occupancy restrictions. And historically, these aren't new as of this year or even last year. They've been around. I think a lot of the original bylaws for ADUs came into play in the 80s and 90s, and they were called accessory apartments. And they were most usually above garage in-law suites. And California and Oregon more recently have kind of led the way to turn them into what they are right now, which is a very nice smaller dwelling unit that could be attached, could be above a garage, but could even be a second house on a property, which is what we're getting very excited about. And a lot of our aging population is getting excited about a small 900 square foot, more affordable dwelling unit in a neighborhood where they've always lived.
Thanks. And what goes into constructing an ADU? Can you talk a little bit about the typical construction process and advice for someone where to start if they want to construct an ADU?
Yeah, building an ADU varies pretty significantly. Unfortunately, in New England, it tends to be more difficult than elsewhere because of all of the installation requirements and frost protection. But on the easiest end of it, if you have a well-built garage on a foundation that's frost protected and usable, it could be as easy as adding a bathroom, adding drywall, and maybe a few windows, and being into it for up to maybe $90,000 to $100,000. It could be as complicated as building an entirely new house on a property or trying to renovate or completely restructure an old Victorian. So the range is quite large, and really it comes down to, in terms of what do you choose, who's going to live in it, what do they need. And I mentioned earlier, it's hard to do the simplest versions of this in Maine, especially converting garages, because a lot of garages aren't built to be ready to convert to a dwelling unit. I know Eli's had a lot of success with space conversions in South Portland based on past conversations. But there's a huge range of possibilities. The work that goes into it spans from figuring out small civil engineering problems, like getting power to the ADU, making sure you're dealing with drainage appropriately, doing a survey to make sure that you're building within setbacks, all the way to doing architectural design work and engineering to build, to know what you're going to build before you build it and satisfy the needs of a growing number of towns. Most towns in Maine are very, very laid back when it comes to building code and submittal processes. Towns near Portland, not so much. It's become very, very difficult to build anything, including a small ADU. But I will give Eli another. We haven't done anything up in Belfast yet, but we do like working in South Portland despite the sprinkler ordinance. The best advice I can give as to where to start, the first step is not hiring an architect. I think that's the most common thing we hear. And it's kind of just, oh, an architect, they know how to build houses or they know how to design houses. The first step is trying to get a handle on your base cost of doing the work. And the base cost is, what are the utilities going to cost? What is the foundation going to cost? What is the site work going to cost? Because that will tell you how much house you can afford. When you're dealing with small structures, less than 1,400 square feet, the cost of all of that stuff that just makes the house a house, but doesn't ultimately, you don't think about it, can be 50% of the overall cost. So you don't want to pay architect fees. You don't want to get into even an expensive survey before you know what that initial ticket's going to be. And that will help you back into what you can actually spend on the walls, the kitchen, and the bathroom.
Thanks. And this is sort of a two-part question. What creative solutions have you developed in designing ADUs to address some of these challenges you talked about? And alongside of that, how does your company try to maintain affordability in your products?
Yeah, so the number one thing that we started doing after about 2 years in business is a paid feasibility study, kind of getting into putting some numbers on those things I just mentioned. What is it going to take to get electrical? And we very quickly threw away the concept of doing free estimates, because ultimately an ADU project, whether it's converting a garage or building a standalone house, is too complicated to do a free estimate. This isn't replacing a roof. It's not doing siding where you just multiply the square feet by 7 or 10 or whatever the cost might be. So it makes free estimates, I would not hesitate to say, completely useless when you're looking at new home construction or new ADU construction. So we rolled out a feasibility study, which is very much like a home inspection, that allows a homeowner to spend a little bit of money and get this baseline of information. You can reuse your septic, or you can connect to your well, or you're going to have to cut a giant trench in the street in order to do sprinklers, and help them understand that. So then they can start shopping for subcontractors and whoever's going to help with it. So I think that's the biggest thing that we've done that's out there for everybody. Affordability is a enormous challenge. We came into this as that being our goal. The last 4 years have made everything unaffordable to most people, including ADUs, unfortunately. ADUs are still more affordable than building a new house because they're reusing infrastructure. They're not getting new driveways. They're not buying land. So the starting point is a lot better. But what we're doing right now to try to maintain affordability is we are constantly looking for ways to increase the number of ADUs we're building by increasing the productivity of our team in order to distribute over more houses. So essentially, we're trying to find ways that we can do a full design build process without needing to charge full design build fees per house. And the result is keeping basically a full service package on par with a stick build house or kind of a custom architect designed house, but unfortunately still not where it needs to be for where interest rates are, because our current costs are for an 800 square foot standalone ADU, that's coming in between 250 and 300,000 in cities like Portland and South Portland. 4 years ago, it used to be between 150 and 200,000, which if you were to take a mortgage out at 3.5% or a second mortgage, it's like $600 a month. So it used to be extremely affordable. Now it's only relatively affordable.
Thanks. And are there any other main obstacles you've observed that people are experiencing that you want to talk about before we shift over to the planning side of things?
Yeah, the biggest one, the biggest new one that's becoming increasingly popular in towns, and Maine is actually leading the way in this. It's one of the few things it's leading Massachusetts over, and it's sprinklers. Sprinklers are very, very expensive as a portion of these projects. They tend to cost $15,000 to $25,000, which is a full 10% of the project cost. And that number does push this out of a lot of people's price point. And we have had middle income households continue to live in their old house that doesn't have egress windows, that has fire hazards, that doesn't have working sprinklers because they couldn't build a brand new all electric home and put sprinklers in it. So that's a huge barrier. It's a barrier because of the cost, but it's also a barrier because the sprinkler industry in Maine and Massachusetts and New Hampshire is not equipped to put sprinklers in small homes. There's only a handful of designers here that are able to do that work. And there's an even smaller number of installers that are able to do that work. So it's pretty much becomes a stopping point for people. So that's the big one. And then the second one just continues to be cost pressure, which Maine is hopefully going to add financing for. There was some really good conversations in a legislative working committee. Massachusetts has financing for it. New York just opened financing for it. So I think there's a great opportunity for municipalities and states to get involved to help on that front.
Thank you. So now I want to move over to talk about the municipal permitting side with Eli and John. Let's start with Eli. Eli, can you tell us about South Portland's updated ADU regulations, and how does the city view ADUs as a strategy to address the local housing shortage?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of list through some of the highlights of the recent zoning amendment, and then talk about it in context generally with the city's housing policy. So probably the very first one is about the process. So one of the first things that the city really tried to tackle was the process to get an ADU permit to build an ADU. So it used to be you'd need to go to the planning board, you'd need to mail abutter notices to all your neighbors. It's a more extensive process. It's something that what we found, most people who are interested in developing ADUs are not the same people that are the contractors that come in and get permits most of the time, who are very comfortable with that process. And so one of the things we saw right off the bat was, once we removed this requirement for a public hearing and mailing all your neighbors, we had all kinds of interest in people who just weren't comfortable with that process, but had actually wanted to build an ADU this whole time. So that was one thing: simplify the process. And that's been terrific. It also reduces costs a bit because there's added expense to both of those things. Another significant change was the size. So in South Portland now, an ADU can be as large as 90% of the primary dwelling unit. And there's a few other stipulations. depending on your lot size, which would be up to 800 square feet or 90%, or up to 1,200 square feet if you have a larger quarter acre lot. We have found this to be very significant also, because as Chris has mentioned, if you're going to be spending 300 to 450,000 or more, an 800 square foot apartment, that's a great 2-bedroom apartment or a studio or something, and that is a little bit more aligned with what people can afford than the earlier requirement, which was that, I can't remember if it was 30% or 50% of the size of the primary dwelling. So that's a significant increase, a significant improvement. They really opened up the door for people. And the other kind of interesting part of this too is, and I think that I looked this up recently, the median size ADU that we've been permitting is somewhere around 600 square feet. Actually, I'd be curious to hear from John and Chris, like kind of what your median size is that you see. But one of the things that we see is, like Chris said, we see a lot of these interior conversions, or turning a house essentially into a duplex, except that it's just a primary dwelling unit and an accessory dwelling unit. And having this size be up to 90% really helps with that. South Portland removed its parking requirement. LD 2003 is going to do the same thing for communities across the state. But this was a part of the ordinance amendment when it occurred in 2021. And the other big thing that I think we'll be curious what other communities do too is that now in South Portland, ADUs can be attached or detached. They can be inside an existing structure or as a new structure. And of course, that's another thing that LD 2003 provides regulation around too. So I think those are probably the biggest. The one other component, and this is where it lends into, how do we see ADUs in the larger context of housing policy in South Portland, is that there is an owner occupancy requirement for ADU construction in South Portland. And, I don't think that's not certainly a universal thing across the state. That's not anything that LD 2003 required. But it was a conscious decision by City Council at that time to say that, ADUs are not going to be the silver bullet that is going to be the fix to the housing shortage. But what it is it's going to be kind of a surgical intervention. It's going to address a very specific thing. And that is primarily what we've seen, people who are renting or finding accommodations for folks within their own family. So this could be a child or a parent or a cousin or just a good friend, but essentially rentals that are not arm's length. And what we see is that all of these people need housing also, right? And all of these people are not able to find housing on the open market, and that this was a tool to help with that in those particular circumstances. And that's kind of the way that our city council saw this as a housing opportunity.
Great. Chris or John, did you want to chime in about the median size for ADUs you've been seeing?
Yeah, our sweet spot is an 800 square foot 2-bedroom. It tends to fit well in most suburban backyards, and it's plenty of size for a single elderly person that's downsizing.
Maggie, we've had a couple of ADUs be built since I've been with the city. I can't tell you specifically if it's 600 or 800 square feet, but it's in that size range.
Thanks. And you're up next, John. Can you tell us a little bit about ADU regulation in Belfast?
Yeah, absolutely. So the city passed the ADUs back in 2017. The city has allowed duplexes in every residential zoning district since 1985. So the density requirement was already allowed. When it was first passed, the city had identified identified that ADUs had to be in a detached structure from the primary unit. So you could build the unit in a garage or a brand new standalone structure. The max size, according to the code, is 800 square feet or 75% of the primary, whichever one is less. And we require, now mind you, this does not include updates that we're currently working on for LD 2003. But the minimum size is 200 square feet, and we require there be at least one parking space.
Thanks. So this is for both of you, John and Eli. Can you tell us what are the main permitting challenges you've seen with building ADUs, and what are some common regulatory questions you receive?
Sure. I can take a first stab at that. Probably the first permitting challenge is that we often have homeowners who are very creative about the way that they would like to use space that we might consider insufficient. So maybe it doesn't really have a safe means of egress. It doesn't really have separated entrance or separated utilities, although that in itself is not particularly an issue, not in South Portland. Some communities may regulate that, but that is definitely one thing. We'll see people want to turn a basement that maybe used to be a rec room or a place where they worked out, and they think, well, now that we can have ADUs, why don't we just put a toilet in the basement and we'll call it good, we'll call that an ADU. So although that's been a common thing, actually a fair amount of those we have been able to help walk them through to be able to turn that into something that is a safe and acceptable dwelling unit, independent cooking, cleaning, and sanitary facilities. Not for everyone, but for most people, they just kind of don't know quite how to get there. And one of, I guess I forgot to mention it after the last question, one of the other significant changes that we've been doing in South Portland is we do a lot more help with the process. So because we see that primarily applicants have never done a development before, they may have never even come into the code and planning office before, or gotten a permit before, that we're doing a lot more help, hand-holding, and it's actually been really great because it's provided an opportunity for us to maybe educate and help people with respect to like best practices or layout or materials or resources to turn to. So that would be one. The other one, and this may be a peculiar one just with South Portland. Maybe other communities have a different situation, but we also find that many people come in to build an ADU, and it's not actually an ADU that they need. They just want to have a somewhat separated place for their father-in-law to move in. And, different communities regulate these differently, but it comes down to what the definition of a dwelling unit is. And in South Portland, a dwelling unit is structurally set up to really just have one family with one kitchen. We can have multiple bathrooms and multiple sleeping areas, but we're still, I think, trying to figure out what is the balance there for people who don't actually need a completely independent dwelling unit, but who want some amount of independence. And so there's this term called a junior ADU, which is prevalent in California and probably other states, and maybe even other municipalities in Maine. It's not something that LD 2003 contemplated, but it could be something that we start seeing as we start seeing, an even more intricate web of housing opportunity or like housing availability.
Thanks. Did you want to respond, John? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Belfast, what we're seeing is, unlike some other communities, the majority of our ADUs are approved by the code enforcement officer. And so I was talking with Steve, and he had identified some of the challenges that he's seeing from folks. And it's how do these new units actually meet the building, plumbing, and electrical code? because what he's finding is folks have an old garage that they want to put this unit in, and that entire structure needs to meet the requirements of MUBEC or the plumbing code. And because of the folks who are coming forward, they don't have the understanding of what that takes.
Thanks. And I have a question related to that actually was from someone who posted on Facebook after we advertised the panel that's related. How do your towns regulate utilities with ADUs? And can ADUs share utilities with a primary residence?
Yeah, in South Portland, it's not something that our ordinance regulates. It's one of the things that we tend to provide a lot of guidance around in our initial meetings with applicants, especially with respect to sewer. A lot of property owners don't know the age of their sewer. They don't know the condition of their sewer. In South Portland, most properties are not on septic. They are on sewer. But so one thing we are able to do is advise people as to the steps that they need to take to determine if they do need separate service or if they can be combined. But otherwise, we just try to help applicants think through, what is the long-term use of the ADU going to be? Maybe you're building it right now because your daughter needs a place to live, can't find a place to live, and so that's going to be great. But long-term, if your plan is to rent it out, then having a separate utility drop, do that now, right? We're not going to require it, but it's something that you should consider.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of that, Maggie, before we move on, because that's really important. Is the unit going to be individual? Is it going to be separated from the primary, or is it going to be attached to it? Because you can't have like the electrical panel be in the primary and you're renting it out and be able to shut off the power to your tenant. Like, that's not okay.
That's a good point.
I would add to that from our experience. So we utilities, specifically water and sewer, are two things that could get very expensive in a hurry. And they tend to get really expensive in a hurry if the municipal DPW gets involved and decides that they're going to create requirements for hooking up ADUs. Luckily, we've not really seen this in Maine yet, but we do see that towns kind of jump on this and tend to go down a path of adding unnecessary cost ADUs. So Portland has a kind of a minor example of this. They have an odd rule that's, I apologize if it is well documented, but we don't feel like it's well documented, where you can't bring sewer from a detached ADU into the basement of the existing house in order to connect to where it leaves to go to the street. And there are many situations where you just have to do that, or you could easily add $5,000 to $10,000 to the project. There's other examples. Concord, Massachusetts is one where their DPW has gotten way too involved in trying to define how to get water and sewer to an ADU, and they have a rule that, and there's no wiggle room in Concord with a DPW, and that's typically how DPWs are. They have a safety priority. Water companies, it's black and white. And if the home has a water service that's older than 30 years, even if it's beautiful 1-inch copper, you have to pull the whole thing up, replace it, and put in a water meter pit in the front yard in order to build the ADU. And that's a $15,000 line item. And we just did this in Concord, and we pulled out beautiful type K brand, like copper. It doesn't go bad. But for some reason, the DPW in Concord thinks it's necessary because it makes it slightly easier for them to read the meters when they're in a pit or service the meters. But it pushes most homeowners out of the ability to pay for these things. So I think for everyone listening, especially people in towns, as these become more prevalent, be very cautious with letting DPWs start adding these kinds of restrictions where an ADU needs its own sewer service or it needs its own water service, because it will quickly make them even more unaffordable.
And just a few more questions for Eli and John before we move over to financing. How do you anticipate LD 2003 will assist residents in your communities who are interested in building ADUs?
But before I jump into that, I just want to mention or kind of respond to Chris's comment. I mean, he's completely right, absolutely, about the magnitude of the cost associated with changing existing utilities. I mean, that's unquestionable. And whenever we can, we definitely do encourage applicants to try to find the cost-effective solution. But I also just want to make sure, attendees to the webinar know, a lot of homes that maybe were built 100 years ago with clay sewer pipe. Sure, our municipality may not require you to do anything special there, just plumb right into it. But you may be setting yourself up for a very expensive and challenging fix down the road. And so sometimes when it turns out to be that they're already going to be doing some site work or regrading the driveway because now they have two entrances, we've had success in recommending to people, maybe you're 50% of the way there, you really ought to use this opportunity to either inspect or just make sure you're not going to shoot yourself in the foot, because that sewer line that was put in 100 years ago anticipated your 4-bedroom house and not an additional 2-bedroom. So it just, Chris is 100% right about being cautious about the cost, but it is important to be cautious in general and just really go into it with both eyes open.
We actually have an example in South Portland that we just did a feasibility on, and he has half-inch galvanized water service line. Big bold, get rid of the half-inch galvanized. You can't do all this work and not do that, because incrementally on something like that, you absolutely have to do that update. And he's already having water problems. Like the pipe's probably got that much water going through it. But yeah, there's a lot of bad infrastructure out there.
But to answer your question about how LD 2003, at least in South Portland, our ordinance amendment was passed prior, previously, and it was in anticipation of LD 2003. So we're not expecting any other amendment or any other change. But I will say that the reduction in parking to 0 was influenced by the upcoming, requirement to comply with 2003, and that can't be understated. That's a very significant impact. Especially on smaller lots and within more urban environment. So that's something that we see.
Thanks.
Yeah, what I expect to see in Belfast, since we already allow duplexes and ADUs, being able to get that 3rd unit on a property that's in a growth zone. I'm not necessarily expecting anybody to rush out and do it, but at least they have the option to. The other pieces, there's a lot of tweaks that need to go into bringing our current code into compliance with LD 2003, like the parking requirement and minimum maximum sizes for the unit itself. But overall, I don't see it having an outsized impact on the housing crisis that we're in.
Thanks. So now I think we can move over to financing. So I have a few questions for Chelsea. So Chelsea, can you tell us some financing options for ADUs? I guess if you want to start with the common ones, and then we can talk about if you've heard of any more inventive options.
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing, with LD 2003, everything's been evolving, and it's everybody trying to get a handle on it. And obviously Maine is one of 50 states, so there's a lot of policy and regulation around financing that is on a national level, whereas we're obviously looking at it on more of a localized level. So you've always got your traditional, cash out refinance option, which during more favorable rate environments. That was a very common occurrence, from the 2020 through even into the 2022 year. I worked with a lot of clients on a cash out refinance deal where they were getting into a 3% or 4% rate, and everything was all kosher with that. So it just worked really well to get them the cash to manage their project as they wanted to. And then the alternative to that is usually looking at just a home equity, either a fixed loan or a line of credit. Again, with the changing rate environment, both our traditional conventional mortgage rates have been heavily impacted by the volatility in the economic venues here, but so have the consumer loan products, which is what your home equity products fall under. And so where everything is kind of riding in that 6, 7, even up to 8% range right now, it certainly is putting a lot of constraint on the ability for people to work this into the equation. There are certainly people who reach out and they want to do these substantial projects, but ultimately looking at, those cash out refinance situations really are not a viable avenue at this point, because if someone's in a 3% mortgage rate, they're not giving that up to build. So I think there certainly is a lot of opportunity for more incentives out there to make our housing stock as plentiful or closer to plentiful as it needs to be, because we certainly have an extreme shortfall in our available housing units across the state. As you know, so like for your credit unions and your small community banks, most of us operate with portfolio loan products, which means that we're holding those in-house. So we're not as tied up with the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA and different government underwriting guides. They give us a lot of latitude to do what we feel is appropriate and within our constraints for risk evaluation internally. And where we do hold the bulk of our loans on our books, we do exercise that. And so we certainly have scenarios where we're by and large, we don't do purchase plus improvement projects. However, we have the ability to kind of do them more of on a case by case basis. Again, we get inquiries here and there. It's similar to, I would say, when the tiny homes, really became a big thing. Everybody wanted a tiny home all of a sudden. They said, oh, this is the way to go for sure. And then there's so many financing constraints around tiny homes because there's no way to appraise them. There's no, you can't make a mortgage on something you can't appraise and something that isn't a stationary object. So those got rolled into an RV loan, which has shorter term limits on them, so we finance tiny homes under a 12-year term as opposed to a 30-year term, which obviously is a big difference in people's monthly budget. And then of course, where do you put a tiny home? You put it on a piece of land. So are you buying a piece of land and we're financing, we do land loans. So we're financing the land loan and then we're financing the RV unit that's a tiny home, and kind of putting all these products together to make it work. But again, there's only so much that certain budgetary constraints are going to allow for. So tiny homes, unfortunately, really became more of a luxury item for people. You had to have the financial background to be able to support that. And then with ADUs, I think we're kind of in the same position right now, again, just because the market is so out of sorts, where the financial aspect of it is so great. The cost to build is huge right now. I know my home, actually, when I purchased my home, my neighbors, well, they sold me the house and moved next door, but they were actually planning to put an ADU on their home, and they weren't able to do so because of the property value issues. They couldn't get, this was back in 2010, which, nobody thinks that we're headed towards that kind of market again, where we're going to run into huge value issues. but I mean, the verdict in my mind is still out. I have a very conservative financial mindset, so I'm a little bit skeptical that you know, we're not going to be in a position where values do come down a bit from where they've been. But ultimately, you know, the appraised value subject to those improvements they intended to make just wasn't there. And then on top of that, the zoning restrictions and we abut wetlands and all of that, you know, really tied into the mix with getting the approval from the municipality. So there's obviously a lot in the mix. And there's right now just the cost is enormous. And so we certainly, I think, could benefit from some incentive programs like California and Vermont have rolled out, where they're trying to incentivize building these additional units, and that would definitely go a long ways in Maine for sure.
Thanks, Chelsea. I think you answered all of my questions on that one.
All at once.
Yes. I have one more question though before we turn it over. Do you have any advice for someone looking to build an ADU who already has a mortgage?
I mean, the biggest thing, of course, is just getting the full spectrum on the cost. You know, I don't remember if it was Eli or Chris or John who said that, but you know, avoid the architect. You know, don't go into that cost prematurely. I think a lot of times people they get really excited about these projects without thinking through all of the costs in the mix. And so certainly working with someone who's well versed in it and has an understanding, comprehensive understanding of what the real costs are going to look like is imperative before incurring any of those costs getting into it. Because from my perspective, you know, before we really get anything underway, we've got to know what we're looking for. You know, the difference between a $200,000 build and a $300,000 build is very substantial for a lot of people. So, you know, it's really treading kind of carefully in that process. You know, having a solid and, again, you know, a very conservative mindset when I'm reviewing mortgage products, but trying to, you know, everybody thinks their house is a gold mine, and I have, you know, for the most part, appraisals are still coming in to adequately support purchase transactions, but I have started to see a little bit of a decline on those overall values. So, you know, someone might go into it and say, oh, well, I have a mortgage for $200,000 outstanding, but you know, so my house is worth 600,000. So, you know, they've got plenty of room to work with in that mentality, but all of a sudden their house appraises at 450,000, then that certainly is going to be more limiting for them. So, I think really for people to have a solid understanding of what their costs are going into it, and then being realistic about what the value of their current residence is from the start is very beneficial.
Thanks, Chelsea. So I think we'll go ahead and start with Q&A. I have a few questions that have been coming in while the panelists have been answering my questions, so I'll start with those. But if you have a question, feel free to either put it in the chat or raise your hand. And we also have Hillary from DECD who can help out with answering questions as well. So the first question I have: what exactly counts as an ADU? Does it need its own bathroom, its own kitchen? And this is a question for the group.
So I can take a first crack at it. So an accessory dwelling unit is a dwelling unit, and so it needs to contain the things that a dwelling unit is required to contain. My understanding is that's defined differently in every municipality, but that commonly they require independent from the primary, independent cooking, cleaning, and sleeping facilities. So that would be a bathroom, a kitchen, and a place to sleep. Beyond that, the what would it be? The IRC, the building code, is going to have requirements about what the size of the bathroom is, what the relationship or what the size of the relationship between cooking appliances, entrance and exit. But it can be pretty creative. I mean, it can be like kind of a one room situation, as long as it meets building code.
Thanks. Anyone else want to chime in on that one? Now I can move on to the next one. So this is a question for Chelsea. Can a municipality's owner occupancy requirement affect one's ability to secure a loan?
So, I mean, we don't tend to get into the municipalities, rules around occupancy and everything. From our standpoint, we're really evaluating more so the overall federal guidelines on that. Mortgages are not written under home rule as Maine municipalities operate. So, however, that said, that certainly does play into appraisal value. So like with an ADU, if a municipality is only allowing for it to be, occupied by a family member, all of those rules, which I did run into in the past, there were certainly some limitations around the permitting for that and all of that fun stuff. So, which again, if you're looking to generate some rental income out of the unit, that's really what it makes the difference in. However, that said, there's only certain loan products that are allowing us to count the income from ADUs at this point. FHA just very recently, like within the past month, updated their guidelines to allow rental income to be used towards the qualifying income for a borrower. However, Fannie Mae guidelines have not been updated to allow rental income to be used. So there's still obviously a lot of kinks to be worked out, and there's varying programs and rules, across the board. Like I had mentioned in my opening remarks with the rural development product, I've been working with that product for 15 years, and it wasn't until the last year or so that they opened that up to even allow accessory dwelling units to be eligible under their financing. Again, that said, it does have to be on the same meter and same service as the primary structure, which as these gentlemen have pointed out, can create their own special barriers in making this a feasible and viable long-term option for people. But there's certainly a lot of varying details out there with different requirements and different restrictions on how we move forward.
And
I guess I would follow.
Oh, go ahead.
I would add to that. As Chelsea mentioned, there's all of the federal rules around lending and considering ADUs for as mortgages have just gotten more liberal, and they continue to get more liberal. And there's a lot of lobbying going on around that. There was a guy named Chris Schwartz who runs United Dwellings, which is a huge ADU garage converter in LA. And he personally has been working to get Freddie Mac to update their rules. I do have a follow-up question to you, Chelsea. I thought, are you familiar with the Fannie Mae Restyle loans for ADUs? I thought those were considering rental income from ADUs pretty much in line with two-family at this point.
I'm thinking that might be the Home Ready program with Fannie Mae, possibly. I am not personally familiar. I haven't had any experience with that product specifically. So I'm not sure what advancements they've made. I just know that they have had some very recent guidance updates on that.
Chelsea, I'm curious also if you, we had an applicant that was educating me about reverse mortgages, and I don't know if that's something that you've done before for ADUs or have any, guidance on.
Yeah, so I don't personally do reverse mortgages, but I do have a referral partner that we work with, where I do a lot with the Rural Development Program and home repair loans and grants. Sometimes those borrowers need really ultimately long-term need a reverse mortgage in order to continue to stay in their home. She has certainly enlightened me a bit on the options to do a purchase transaction as a reverse mortgage. So that is an option. So when you have these multi-generational families, certainly that are looking to purchase a home, you know, for the long term, I think that would definitely be a viable option, you know, as long as someone is coming into it with sufficient equity, you know, at the start of the process. And reverse mortgages, again, the FHA, you know, opening up the restriction there certainly may be beneficial on that side. But most reverse mortgages are written under FHA guidelines. So that's very advantageous. And I think it certainly could be very helpful for those families that perhaps want to be able to long-term plan for their heirs, their children, you know, some family member to be able to take over the property down the road, but also be able to have a separate dwelling on the property. I think that would be great. So the biggest concern with reverse mortgages is oftentimes when people, especially when they have family, you know, to leave their estate to, reverse mortgages come with some hefty costs to them. So they're often a great product for people who don't really have any family or any heirs to receive that equity. But you know, every circumstance is different. And certainly for our aging population, I always encourage them, you know, there's a lot of people who come in, they say, oh, my daughter says, no way, do not do a reverse mortgage. And I say, well, can your daughter support you financially? Because if not, then the focus really needs to be on your financial well-being while you're here. And so it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all situation, but certainly something worth exploring for those who have the equity in the property.
Thanks. And we have lots of questions coming in, which is great. I'm going to turn it over to Amy Dresser, who has her hand up, and then we'll go back to the chat questions.
Thank you. I'm joining today as a member of the Yarmouth Affordable Housing Committee. And I have a question for Chris, real quick, regarding, I understand that it may vary similar to a home inspection when you were talking about the paid feasibility study, depending on different factors, but I'm wondering if you can share generally what a range would be for the cost of the study.
Yeah, we charge $600 for those, pretty much set based on what's charged for home inspections.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. And I'm not, it says it's directed to Chris, but I think it might mean it should be Eli or John. Can you share a question on why and how you created a regulation that ADUs be rented for at least 90 days? I am wondering about ADUs being built for short-term rentals in my coastal community, which hosts a large vacation visitor business sector.
Sure, I can kind of answer. In South Portland, it's not 90 days, but there's a requirement that ADUs are rented for 30 days or more. So essentially, there's a blanket prohibition on short-term renting of an accessory dwelling unit. And it actually, council went a step beyond so as to additionally exclude any other dwelling unit on the property from short-term rentals. So as Chris had described earlier, if you want to consider an ADU kind of a loophole in the general scheme, one of the costs of that, or you know, in the give and take, is that to establish an ADU on a property, the community is saying, okay, but that means that all the dwelling units on that property are going to be dwelling units. They're not going to be short-term rentals. And then, you know, separately, South Portland regulates short-term rentals with a licensing scheme.
Thanks. So this is for Chris. Chris, you described many barriers to building housing that is affordable to average people, not just ADUs. What kind of effective pushback to these requirements, i.e. sprinklers, interior egress, etc., could you envision to help lower cost of construction?
Unfortunately, pushback on a lot of this stuff is really difficult because it's specifically with sprinklers, it's immediately turned into a life safety question. And the nature of our time is that if you have a life safety argument, people are just getting in line and not trying to say, well, if we're going to require these sprinklers, like how many, like what is the net impact of that? And I don't honestly know what the net life safety factor is, but I do know that it prevents a lot of people from getting into a new house that's generally safer than where they lived, whether it's for accessibility features or just not be living in a second floor without egress windows. So sprinklers are tough, and to fight back against those, it takes a lot of courage to make the case to the fire chief that it's not necessary, even if the risk is saving even if the risk is it saves 1 in a million or 1 in 1,000, whatever it might be, someone has to raise that and say, look, we have to take that risk in order to build housing, and someone's got to say it. And I loosely say it. I'm saying it right now, and you can probably tell by my pushback on it. I have a very firm position that we shouldn't be requiring sprinklers. It's not worth the net improvement in safety. I would support on the other side requiring solar systems on a southern facing roof because the net benefit to society is there, but not necessarily for sprinklers. For the DPW stuff, again, it's a courage and like getting in front of it. DPWs tend to operate, I believe, mostly appointed officials, hired employees. They're not town council, so they can't get voted in and out, but they require a level of oversight from town councilors, somebody to say, hey, look, I know that meter pit or that new water line is going to make it easier for your department, but you're going to have to just deal with that lesser efficiency because the net increase in cost to this homeowner isn't worth it. But there's not a group that's giving that pushback right now. And as a result, what happens is these things are net positives, like incremental. They're incremental improvements in infrastructure. They're incremental improvements in life safety. So as one town does it, the next town does it too, because at first glance, it looks like a good idea. And I said Maine's leading the way in New England for sprinklers. And I think it's because I don't know which municipality did it first, but it might have been Portland, but everyone's jumping on the bandwagon and the towns are falling one by one. And unfortunately, incomes in Maine are less than they are in greater Boston. And we just can't afford it. I mean, we built we put more sprinklers in ADUs in Maine at this point than we've never done it in Massachusetts, and we've built equal numbers of ADUs in both states. So I think that kind of puts it out there. I don't think we want to be leading in some of this stuff, but it needs to be we need to have courage to push back against it, and we need to look past being labeled as not wanting the better infrastructure or not wanting that incremental improvement in life safety. We just have to do it.
Eli or John, do you want to respond to that before I go on, or?
No, I think that question is too hard for me to answer. So we'll leave it at Chris's.
I'll take the blowback from whomever wants to say anything. It's a tough one.
Maggie, I did speak with our code enforcement officer about pieces of this. One of the topics that was earlier in this conversation revolved around the sewer line. The city requires that you can't have your detached ADU have that sewer line go through the primary structure. And that the basis for that is out of the 2015 plumbing code, and it's also written into the city code of ordinances. And the rationale behind it is if there's an issue with primary, the folks in the other unit may not understand that the pipe is blocked and you could end up having sewer overflows. It's trying to prevent those situations. And because it's in the plumbing code, I don't know how flexible that we can be at changing it.
And that's a great example of an incremental improvement that sounds awesome. But at the end of the day, these people are neighbors. If the plumbing is backing up in their basement, there's a solution that's called knocking on their door. As far as the plumbing code goes, it's very rare for municipalities to interpret the plumbing code that way. So I think there's multiple interpretations of that, because it's more frequent that that is not enforced in the municipality.
Thanks. So this is another question for Eli. Have you had any issues with the abutters related to the ADU permitting process, since they are not required to go through a public hearing process? Did you educate the public prior to the ordinance change? How did that process go overall?
Great question. Short answer is no. I mean, no, the answer is never no, but we did do, but it has not been maybe what people expected it to be. That is to say, no, there has not been overwhelming issues with the abutters related to ADUs because they weren't noticed. They didn't know about the project. That has not been our experience. We did do some significant educational outreach, leading up to the implementation of the ordinance, just before it was to be enacted. And that was really great. I mean, I think the biggest feedback was, why hadn't this been done sooner? And so while I'm not sure if maybe it was 5 or between 5 and 10 years ago, it was a very different maybe sentiment that really ADUs were going to cause significant nuisance in the neighborhoods. They're really going to change the character of the place. They're going to have all kinds of unintended consequences. And I think it was really made out to be a little bit more of a hazard. At least it was perceived as a hazard. I think in many communities still is, that at the end of the day, I think people, at least locally here, are not seeing it as such, seeing that ADUs are quite benign and actually beneficial. So I'm saying that I sit across the hall from the code office, who is going to be the ones getting the complaints, but I don't believe that they've been inundated with those. So it's been a good experience so far.
Great. I think this is a question for everyone. Can it be more efficient and affordable to plan ADUs as part of new construction projects?
Yeah, it certainly can be. If you think ahead and upsize the septic, do a 1-inch water line instead of a 5/8 or 3/4, those things definitely make sense to do up front. And there is an increased, I know that there are several ADU subdivision concepts in the works in New England. I know we're going to hopefully be working on one next year, possibly in Westbrook. And then there's one in Charlton, Mass. That's in early stages, but it is a concept that I think is going to take off, because it gets better use out of the infrastructure that goes into a subdivision. And there are people looking to do this and consolidate households into new rather than trying to adapt old. The other thing that's really neat about potentially doing this up front in subdivisions is there are ownership models that would allow you to sell this single family home as you normally would, and allow an investment company to hold on to all the ADUs and rent them out affordably. It's essentially creating a bunch of 2 families and helping basically make interest rates work, because all of these things are very difficult to pencil out now at 8 to 11%. So there's a lot of neat stuff coming on that front, and I think it's probably going to start taking off in the next couple of years.
Anybody else want to respond to that question? Okay, next question. Our small town has no municipal water or sewage. All have individual wells and septic, yet many, as we are on the coast, bring in necessary income by creating rentals. There are very few building restrictions also, and people are resistant to change. Will wells and septic be a drawback when our town begins addressing ADUs next year?
I would say not really. Honestly, dealing with a well and a septic or modifying the systems is a lot cheaper than upgrading city sewer and water. At least for now. Again, I keep drawing correlations to Maine and Mass. There are huge differences in the two. Septic design and construction in Maine is still relatively affordable. A brand new 2-bedroom septic system is going to cost between $9,000 and $15,000. So less than sprinklers, less than doing a new street connection. And the designs are also very easy to do. Septic designs in Maine are between $300 and $700, and the septic designers are typically on your property within a week. So I wouldn't worry much about that. Wells can be a little bit trickier because there are way more variables to deal with, from water filtration, pressure pumps, refill rates, wells getting depleted over years. They tend to be trickier, but the most common situation with a well is that you can tap into that existing well and add in a second large pressure tank in the ADU. And you could even put that pressure tank behind an existing filtration system. So there are relatively inexpensive ways to get septic and well up to snuff and take on an ADU. It's intimidating to homeowners, so it's very important to educate them on this, as South Portland's doing. You have to let them know it's not a blocker, and it's ultimately going to be less than 5% of the project cost to make it right.
Maggie, I just want to add for the question in regards to a small coastal community. The septic systems need to be sized accordingly for the additional dwelling unit that's being proposed. A lot of times the septics are designed for the number of units for that home, and it may not be large enough to handle the increased load from the accessory unit.
A neat way to help with that's a relatively easy upgrade for a septic system in a shoreline zone. So we just did one in Harpswell, and they did an aerator system. So it's a pre-treatment that adapts and potentially adapts an existing septic tank, but it allows you to continue to use that existing leach field. And the leach field is the expensive part of the septic system. So you can upgrade you can basically have kind of a water processing station in your tank, or just replace that tank. And again, it becomes a reasonably affordable upgrade to that septic. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I think it increases some leach fields by up to 40%. So you can get an extra bedroom out of them, and still not be dealing with adding nitrogen to the shoreland zone, which is a huge issue down on Cape Cod. It's a very, very expensive area to do this in because of septic in particular, but not the case in Maine yet.
So I'm not a local plumbing inspector first, but I would encourage you to go to your town office and talk to your local plumbing inspector, because, and maybe John, you might be familiar with, because I am not that familiar with, but I believe that there is an allowance for an expansion of an existing system of up to 1 bedroom or 25% of the designed capacity, something along those lines. So if you are contemplating building a small, a 1-bedroom ADU, it's possible, if you talk to your LPI, that you don't have to do any site work to expand your septic.
Yeah, what we found in those instances is to have the septic system reevaluated, make sure that it's still operating properly, make sure that it can handle that load.
Yeah, so especially for those smaller projects, you definitely exercise all those options first before you really think that you need to do a significant change to your system.
you both. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Does anybody have any final questions? Or do any of our panelists have any parting words or guidance for our attendees?
Sure. I would just, I mean, I would really want to thank GrowSmart for hosting this. I think that this type of engagement and outreach and education is like 50% or more. Maybe it's like 90% of the effect of any type of ordinance amendment that liberalizes housing creation. It doesn't mean anything if it just lives within ordinance. And sometimes I know I'm still surprised when I encounter people who don't, even after all the outreach that we did locally, who didn't catch wind, didn't understand that this is an opportunity that's available to them. So opportunities like this are really important. And the resource that GrowSmart put out, the fact sheet is really terrific. And so it's just it's important to remember that I think as we do all of the hard work of actually changing the ordinances and making things easier and getting the financing tools, just education like this is a big part of that too. So
I would second that, Eli. It's a marketing problem. Building ADUs is a marketing problem more than anything else. There's not enough constraints out there to stop it. But towns are not going to see the ADU development that they want until they get out there and partner with nonprofits or private industry to get the word out there. And I think of all of the towns, honestly, in New England, South Portland's leading the way in doing that. And as a result, I don't know what their numbers are, but based on the inbound volume that we get from people in South Portland, they're probably punching above their weight in interest in ADUs in terms of head count. They definitely do more than Portland, and they're not as big as Portland. So it's all about marketing. It's about getting the word out there, and it's about a super helpful building department. Tale of two cities, Portland and South Portland. Portland has a pretty liberal ADU bylaw, but there's not really any help coming out of that building and planning department for individuals. So they're the worst town to build an ADU in New England. And I don't say that lightly because it's calling out our basically hometown, but it's true. It's a marketing problem, and it's about the town being super helpful. So anyone in municipalities out there, you've got to get out and market it, and you've got to be available to pick up the phone when a homeowner calls and asks what they can do.
For sure.
Thanks,
Well said, both of you, and I can attest to that issue in Portland, especially. My husband's a plumber, and to get permits through, it is an act of God. Like it takes a lot of patience, and I think we for a long time we've worked so diligently to maintain our individuality town by town. And this is really an opportunity for the state as a whole to come together and start moving the needle forward to, foster the environment that so many are saying that we want. And, to create the housing stock that this state needs to thrive is really imperative. So thank you again, GrowSmart, and all of you for this discussion tonight.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all. And thank you all to everyone who attended. I hope this was helpful and you learned something from it. And just a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be posted to our social media accounts and our webpage. And also on our webpage, you'll find, and it's what Eli just mentioned, he called it a fact sheet. We call it the community guide. So if you're looking for it on the website, it's our community guides on ADUs. So that's up there as well. And we're also going to be sending out a feedback survey, so look out for that. And thank you so much. I think that's everything for this evening.
Good night, everyone.